In the last video, we went through the phases of a risk assessment, and once those phases are complete, the organisation needs to choose how they want to respond to risk. An organisation has identified risks, analysed the impact and likelihood, and evaluated their significance. They now have to decide how they want to respond to these risks. And when you're thinking about the different ways to respond to risk, I want you to think TARA, which is an acronym which stands for Transfer, Accept, Reduce, Avoid, which are the 4 different options an organisation has when it comes to responding to risk. Transferring the risk means reducing the impact by sharing the risk with a third party. If a company identifies their office as having a high flooding risk, but they are not willing to relocate, they could transfer the risk by purchasing building insurance. Now, if the risk materialises, a large portion of the impact will be with the insurance company. But what if the company is willing to take on the risk without taking any action? Well, that's called risk acceptance. The organisation acknowledges that the risk exists and they will document it in their risk register, but they won't take any action to reduce it. For example, a small company might decide to use a cloud service provider to run their website. One risk they would identify is the website going down if the cloud service provider has a service disruption. They might decide that they are willing to accept this risk as the likelihood is very low and the cost of building their own infrastructure would cost too much. But what if they decide they weren't happy with that level of risk and wanted to do something about it? That's called risk reduction. You might also hear it being called risk mitigation. This is where an organisation applies and implements their own controls to reduce the risk. Let's pretend an organisation has identified the risk of phishing attacks being high and they want to reduce that risk to an acceptable level. To do this, they would invest in controls such as cybersecurity training or two-factor authentication, as both of these controls would reduce the likelihood and impact of phishing. This brings us on to the last response, which is risk avoidance. Risk avoidance is simply stopping the activity that is causing the risk. Let's pretend an organisation is adding a new feature to their app, which will let customers connect in new ways. But after doing a risk assessment, they realised they would need to collect a lot of personal data and would then have to comply with regulations such as GDPR, which carries the risk of big fines. To be compliant with GDPR, they would need to invest a lot of money into controls to meet the requirements. And in this case, we don't think that the value the feature will bring is worth that cost. We are also not willing to accept the risk of being fined. Or in other words, the risk is greater than the reward. So we avoid the risk altogether by not creating the feature. And those are the 4 options we have when it comes to responding to risk. We can share the risk with a third party, we can accept the risk as it is, we can reduce the risk by implementing controls, or we can avoid the risk by stopping the activity causing it.